Alright, we're starting the next chapter of the story of the Moors by Stanley Poole, a young pretender. For 600 years, the greater part of the Mohammedan Empire was nominally under the authority of a central ruler called a caliph, a title which signifies a successor or substitute. At first, this authority was real and powerful. The caliph appointed the governors of all the provinces from Spain to the borders of the Hindu Kush, and removed any of them at his pleasure. But the empire was too large to hold together round a civil pivot for any length of time, and gradually various local governors made themselves virtually independent, although they generally professed the utmost devotion to the caliph and paid him every honor except obedience. By degrees, even this show of respect was thrown off, and dynasties arose which espoused heretical tenets, repudiated the spiritual supremacy of the caliph, and denounced him and all his lines as usurpers. Finally, the time came when the caliphs were as weak in temporal authority as the Pope of Rome, and were even kept prisoners in their palace by the mercenary bodyguard they had hired to protect them against their rebellious nobles. This took place about 300 years after the foundation of the Caliphate, and for the second half of their existence, the caliphs were little more than ciphers to be played by the great princes of the empire, and to contribute a little pomp to their coronation. Finally, the Caliphate was abolished in Asia by the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, and due to the title is still claimed by the Sultan of Turkey, there is no caliph in the old comprehensive sense of the word. The earliest province to shake off the authority of caliph was Andalusia. To understand how this happened, we must remember that the caliphs did not succeed one. Another unbroken line of family inheritance after the first floor Orthodox caliphs Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali were elected more or less by the popular vote. The Syrian party set up Muawiyah as caliphs at Damascus, and from him sprang the family of the Umayyad caliphs, the so-called from their ancestor Umayyad. There were 14 Umayyad caliphs who reigned from 661 to 750. When they were disposed by Ishafa, the butcher, who was the first of the second dynasty of caliphs called the Abbasid, after their ancestors Abbas, an uncle of Prophet Muhammad. The Abbasid caliphs transferred the seat of the government from Damascus to Baghdad and held the caliphate until its destruction by the Mongols in 1258. Among the members of the disposed family of the Umayyad was Abir Rahman, a name which means servant of the merciful God. Most of his relations were estimated by the ruthless Abbasid. They were hunted down in all parts of the world and slain without mercy. Abdul Rahman fled with the rest, but with better fortune, for he reached the banks of the Euphrates in safety. One day, as he sat in his tent watching his little boy playing outside, the children ran to him in a fright, and going out to discover the cause, Abdul Rahman saw the village in confusion and the black standards of the Abbasids on the horizon. Hastily seizing up his children, the young prince rushed out of the village and reached the river. Here the enemy almost came up on them and called out that they need have no fear, for no injury will be done to them. A young brother who accompanied him and who was exhausted with swimming turned back, and his head was immediately severed from his body. But Abdul Rahman held on until he reached the other side, bearing his child and followed by his servant Badir. Once more on firm earth, they journeyed night and day till they came to Africa, where the rest of his family joined them, and the sole survivor of the Umayyad princes had leisure to think of his future. He was but 20 years of age. and full of hope, ambition. His mental powers were considerable, and to these he added the advantage of a noble stature and great physical energy. The courage. The Arab historians, however, add the unfavorable details that he was blind of one eye and devoid of the sense of smell. In his childhood, wise men had predicted great things of his future. And in spite of the ruins of his family, he was not yet daunted. His first thoughts turned to Africa, for he clearly perceived the success of the Abbasid had left him no chance in the east. But after 5 years of wandering about the Barbary coast, he realized that the Arab governor was not easily to be overturned, and that he already revolted Berbers in the west would not willingly surrender their newly won independence for the empty glory of being ruled by an Umayyad. His glance therefore was now directed toward Andalusia, where the various factions and their perpetual strife offered an opening to any clever pretender, and much more to one who could bring such hereditary claims as Abdul Rahman. He therefore sent his servants Badir to the chiefs of the Syrian party in Spain, among whom many were freedmen of the Umayyads, and were thus bound by the Arab code of honor to secure emulations of their former patrons. Badir, after some negotiation with hostile factions, the support of the men of the Yemen was also promised. Upon this, Badr returned to Africa. Abdul Rahman was saying his prayers on the seashore when he saw the vessel approach, which brought him the good news, and prone, as all Easterners are drawn omens from the significant circumstances, the name of the first envoy from Andalusia was presented to him. Ghalib Tamin, which means father of conquest attainment, suggested a happy fate. We shall attain our object, cried the prince, and conquer the land without delay. He stepped on board and they sailed for Spain in September 755. The coming of the survivor of the Umayyads to Andalusia was like a page of romance, like the arrival of the prince. Like the arrival of the prince. To conquer the land. Let's start from the beginning. Ghalib Tamin, which means father of conquest, suggested a happy fate. We shall attain one object, cried the prince, and conquer the land. Without delay, he stepped on board, and they sailed for Spain in September 755. The coming of the survivor of the Umayyad to Andalusia was like a page of romance, like the arrival of the young pretender in Scotland in 1745. The news spread like a conflagration through the land. The old adherents of the royal family hurried to pay him homage, and the descendants of the Umayyad and freemen put themselves under his orders. Even the Yemen clans, though they could not be expected to feel any peculiar sentiment for the young prince, was sufficiently infected by the zeal of his adherents to keep their promise and band together for his support. The governor of Andalusia found himself deserted by most of his troops and forced to wait for a new army. Meanwhile, the winter rains made a campaign impossible and left Abdul Rahman leisure to recruit and organize his forces. In the spring of the following year, the struggle began in earnest. Abdul Rahman was received with enthusiasm at the Archidona in Seville, and thence prepared to march on Cordova. Yusuf, the governor, advanced to resist him, but the Guadalvir was swollen with rains, and two armies on the opposite banks raced with each other, who would first arrive at Cordova at length. Abdul Rahman, by means of a deceitful stratagem unworthy of a prince of romance, induced Yusuf to let him cross the now failing river under pretext of peace, and once on the other side he fell upon the unsuspecting enemy. Victory declared itself for the prince, and he entered Cordova in triumph. He had the grace to exert himself to arrest the plundering passions of his troops, and to place the harem or women folks of the ex-governor in safety. Before the year was out, he was master of the Mohammedan part of Spain, and the dynasty of the Umayyad of Cordova, destined to endure nearly 3 centuries, was established. The king of Cordova, one second please. The king of Cordova, however, was firmly seated without many a struggle. Abdul Rahman had indeed been placed on the throne, but the feat had been accomplished by a small faction out the numerous parties that divided the land. The new sultan was, however, better able than most princes to hold his own amidst the striving elements of his kingdom. Prompt and decisive in action, troubled by few scruples, by turn terribly severe and fastidiously diplomatic. He's very diplomatic, basically. His policies was always equal to an emergency, and there was not a few occasions on which it was put to the test. He had not been going in Andalusia when Ibn Mughif sailed from Africa to set up the black standards of the Abbasids in Spain. He landed in the province of Bija and soon found supporters among the disaffected, always ready to join in some new things. Abdul Rahman was besieged for 2 months in Carmona. The situation was perilous and in a strain, for every day gave the enemy more opportunity, increasing in their fate. Increasing their forces, Abdul Rahman, even full of resource, hearing that the enemy has somewhat relaxed their precautions, gathered together 700 of his bravest followers, kindled a great fire, and saying that it was now a question of death or victory, flung his scabbard into the flames. The 700 followed his example in token of their resolution, never in the sheaths of their swords again till they were free, and sallying out of their leader, fell upon the besieged tooth and nail. The Abbasid invasion was utterly annihilated. Abdul Rahman, with the ferocity that occasionally disfigured him, put their leaders' heads in a bag with descriptive labels attached to their ears, and confided the precious parcel to a pilgrim bound for Mecca, by whom it was put into the hands of the Abbasid Caliph Mansur himself. When Caliph had seen the contents of the bag, he was very wroth, but he could not He could not help exclaiming that God, there was a sea between the man and me. While cordially detesting the successful Sultan of Cordova, his Abbasid foe was forced to render homage to his skill and courage. He called Abdul Rahman the hawk of the Qur'an, the falcon of the Prophet's own tribe. Wonderful, he would exclaim, in the daring wisdom and prudence he has shown. To enter the paths of destruction, throw himself into a distant land, hard to approach, well defended, there to profit by the jealousies of the rival parties to make them turn their arms against one another instead of against himself to win the homage, obedience of his subjects. And having overcome every difficulty to rule supreme Lord of all, I of a truth, no man before him has done this. The defeat of the Abbasid invasion was followed by other successes and part of the new Sultan. He induced the people of Toledo who had held out against him to consent to a peace delivery of their chiefs, and the leaders were grossly humiliated and then crucified. The chief of the Yemenite faction, proving dangerous, Abdul-Rahman gave him a safe conduct and thus enticed him into the palace, but he tried to stab him with his own hand. But finding the Arab too vigorous, called in the guard and had him assassinated. Almost immediately, the great revolt of the Berbers of the northern borders occurred. 10 years were occupied in the reducing them to obedience, and meanwhile the Yemenites, burning with the vengeance for the murder of their chief, took advantage of the Sultan's absence in the north to rise. They had not yet realized the energy of the astuteness of the man. He had already set the revolted Berbers by the ears by playing upon their petty jealousies, and now he exerted his diplomacy to breed discord among the Yemenites. He tampered with the Berbers who formed a large part of their army, so that they deserted the land of the fray, and Abdul-Rahman's soldiers fell upon the flying multitude until 30,000 bodies lay on the field. Their huge grave long remained a sight to be seen by the curious. Then followed that formidable coalition between 3 disaffected Arab chiefs and Charlemagne, which was so near destroying the fabric that Abdul-Rahman had painfully built up, collapsed before Zaragoza and rent valleys without a single blow from the very person they had assembled to destroy. Henceforth, the Sultan was allowed to enjoy in comparative peace the fruits of his victories. He had subdued all the hostile elements in Spain to his iron will. He had cast down the proud Arab chief who had dared to measure swords with him. He had massacred or assassinated the leaders of the rebellion and had proved himself master of the position. But tyranny, cruel and perfidious as his, brings its own punishment. The tyrant may force the submission, but he cannot compare the devotion of his people. And the empire that is won by the sword must be sustained by the same weapon. Honest man refused to enter into the service of a lord who could betray and slay as he did this Sultan. His old supporters, those who had first welcomed him to Spain, now turned coldly away when they saw the tyrant and his naked cruelty. His own relations, who had flocked over to his court as an asylum, they plotted again and again to dispose him, with an inevitable result of losing their heads. Abdul-Rahman was left in mournful solitude. His old friends had deserted him. His enemies, though helpless, cursed him nonetheless. His very kinsmen and servants turned against him. It was partly that the long war with factions had spoiled a fine nature, partly that the character was restless. No longer could he mingle as before in the crowd that prolonged the streets of the Cordova suspicion of everyone. Al-Qadar was suspicious of everyone wrapped in gloomy thoughts and distracted by the bloody memories he wove. Though the streets surrounded by a strong sorry about that. Though the streets surrounded by a strong guard of foreigners, 40,000 Africans whose devotion to the paymaster was equal by their hatred of the whole population whom they repressed, formed the Sultan's protection against the people whom he ground under his heel. In his dissolution, he wrote a poem on a palm which he transplanted from the land of his ancestors. For like most Andalusian Arabs, he was something of a poet in which he compassionated the tree for its exiles. Like me, thou art separated from relations and friends. Thou didst grow in a different soil, and now thou art far from the land of thy birth. He had accomplished the object which he had set before himself in the days of his young ambition, when he came a stranger and alone to subdue a kingdom. He had brought the Arabs and Berbers into subjection and restored order and peace in the land, but he had done it all at the expense of his subjects' heart. The handsome youth who had come like the young chevalier to win the homage and devotion of the Spanish Arabs, after 32 years went down to his grave a detested tyrant, upheld in his blood-stained throne only by the swords of mercenaries. Whose loyalty was purchased by gold. He had inaugurated the sway of the sword in Spain. His successors had maintained the principle. As the great historian of the Moors has observed, it is not easy to see what others meant. The turbulent factions of Arabs and Berbers were to be kept in order, and now hierarchy was to be averted without severe measures of repression. Neither of these races was accustomed to monarchy. Nevertheless, a tyranny so sustained formed a melancholy spectacle, despite all the glorious triumphs that it illuminated. An ancient Arab historian, Ibn Hayyan, gave the following portrait of the first Sultan of Cordova. Abd-Rahman was kind-hearted and well-disposed to mercy. He was eloquent in his speech and endowed with a quick perception. He was very determined, but constant and persevering and carrying them into effect. He was active and stirring. He would never lie in repose or abandon himself to indulgence. He never entrusted the affairs of the governor to anyone, but administered them himself. He never failed to consult in cases of difficulty of man and of wisdom. He was a brave and intrepid warrior, always the first in the battlefield, terrible in his anger and intolerant of his opposition. His constance inspired awe in those who approached him, friends and foe alike. He was wont to follow his buyers and pray over the dead. And in the mosque on Fridays, he would often enter the pulpit and address the people. He visited the sick and mixed with the people in their rejoicing. This is the doubtless young Abd-Rahman before the opposition, and conspiracy had made him suspicious and cruel. Power has often a terrible manner of punishing its possessor. The equal question that is asked when a despot dies is who will succeed him? And the common answer is revolutionary or anarchy. The throne that is set upon steel edges does not steadily pass from father to son, yet the dynasty of Abdul Rahman did not collapse with the death of its despotic founder. It was expected that many hostile forces which he had with difficulty to restrain when released by his death would have sprung into redoubled activity. Such, however, was not the case. Partly because he had too thoroughly terrified the people for them to easily recover their courage, and partly because in his successor they recognized the very antithesis of his father, a prince to be loved and honored. The people remained quiet for some years. Hashem, who in 788 succeeded his father at the age of 30, was a model of all the virtues, and is to make sure that he should practice them with assiduity during his brief reign. An astrologer predicted that he had but 8 years to live. The Sultan naturally devoted his short space to preparing for the next world. In his youth, his palace had been filled with men of science, poets, sages, and the boy was father of the man. His acts of piety were numberless, and in him the indignant and persecuted had a sure refuge. He would send trusty emissaries into all parts of his dominions to seek out wrongdoing and repress it. And to further the cause of righteousness, he had the streets patrolled at night to present riots and vicious conduct. And the fines they levied on the evildoers were distributed among those good souls whom rain and cold could not deter from attending the mosque at nighttime. The Sultan himself visited the sick and would often go forth on stormy nights to carry food to pious and invalid, and to watch beside his bedside. With all this, he was no poltroon. He would lead his armies against the Christians of the north. Like the thoroughbred Arab, he was, and though the people affectionately dubbed him the amiable and the just, he could show sufficient firmness when his reign was menaced by the conspiracy of his uncles. He increased his numbers of Mamelukes and bodyguard, and 1,000 of them were always on duty day and night on both sides of the river to protect his palace. He was a huntsman, yet so scrupulous was that he, when he rebuilt the bridge of Cordova, which still stands to this day, hearing that his subjects murmured that he only built this great work to make his hunting parties more convenient, he vowed he would never cross it again, and he never did. Before the 8 years had quite expired, this exemplary prince had gathered into his well-earned paradise, and then it had become apparent that this very goodness had been served up to serve a new factor of rebellion in the state. This new danger was the power of the Mohammedans. Was the power of the Mohammedans. Priest. The term is hardly an accurate one, for in Islam there is no priesthood in the strict. sense of Catholic Christianity. The men who recite the prayers and preach the weekly sermons in the mosque are laymen taken from their shops or other occupations and appointed for the time to the congregation. There is no distinction between the laik and the cleric in Islam. Nevertheless, there is something more which tallies more or less with what we mean by a priesthood. There is always in Mohammedan countries a body of men whose lives are specially devoted to religion. They may be dervish with particular rites, or they may be merely theological students, pupils of some renowned teacher whose doctrine filled them with unwanted zeal and enthusiasm. They may be reciters of the Quran or schoolmasters. Such a body is found throughout the Muslim world, and it has to be reckoned with in every Mohammedan country. The students of the Azhar Mosque in Cairo, the Sofas in Constantinople, the mullahs in many of the eastern cities have shown what a force of fanaticism can avail in the times of excitement. In Andalusia, this power was now about to be displayed. The first rebellion after Abdul Rahman's death came from the least expected quarter, not from the Christians, nor from any special political parties of Arabs or Berbers, but from the devout sons of Islam, the theological students of Cordova. These students were largely composed of renegades or the sons of renegades. It has already been seen that the Spaniards carefully adopted Islam, and like most converts, become more Muslim than the Muslims themselves. Abdul Rahman was far too wise, and also far too worldly to permit the theologians, especially those of Spanish blood, any preponderating influence in his kingdom. But the pious Hisham neither saw the danger nor had he perceived it, would have disregarded it as a danger at all. He loved to place his confidence in holy men, whose conduct was dictated by the strict observance of their religion, and in whom he failed to detect the germs of common worldly ambition and love of power. It happened, too, that at this time the theologians were headed by a singularly gifted active mind, a favorite pupil of one of the lights in the holy city of Medina. When the Arabian prophet was buried, a man whose soul was devoured by the mixture of the fervor and political ambitions which would so often make havoc the nation. This doctor, Yahweh, profited by the devotion and piety of Hisham to raise the theologians of Cordova to a height of influence and power might have made his true father, Abdul Rahman, turn in his grave.